Sometimes the wildest hearts are simply the most wounded. Sometimes the fiercest creatures are just waiting for someone who understands their pain. In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, there lived a Mustang so fierce that grown men feared to go near him. This giant brown horse had never been broken by any cowboy. For months, he broke fences and scattered cattle. The townspeople said he was cursed. Then, one morning, an old Apache warrior named Dasheen walked into town. His hair was gray, and his eyes were tired from years of fighting. He wasn't looking for trouble. But when he saw that angry horse, something stirred in his heart. This wasn't just any wild Mustang. This was a creature that reminded him of himself, scarred, alone, and running from a painful past. What would happen when two wounded souls finally found each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1887 had been particularly unforgiving to Cedar Ridge, a frontier town that clung to existence like a stubborn weed in the Arizona territory. Dust devils danced through the main street with a frequency that made even the most optimistic settlers question their choice to call this place home. The town consisted of little more than a collection of weathered wooden buildings, their paint long since surrendered to the relentless sun and wind. A general store, a saloon, a sheriff's office, a church that saw more tumbleweeds than congregants, and the stockyards that had become the source of the town's greatest concern. The stockyards sat on the eastern edge of Cedar Ridge, a sprawling collection of wooden corrals and holding pens that had once represented hope and prosperity. Cattle drives would stop here. Cowboys would spend their hard-earned money, and the town would thrive for a few precious weeks before settling back into its quiet existence. But those days seemed like distant memories now, ever since the arrival of the horse that had turned their modest stockyards into a battleground. The Mustang had appeared 3 months ago, captured during a roundup of wild horses in the nearby canyons. He was magnificent and terrible to behold, standing nearly 17 hands high, with a coat the color of rich desert earth and a black mane that flowed like a war banner in the wind. His eyes held intelligence and fury in equal measure, and every inch of his powerful frame spoke of a spirit that had never known submission. The cowboys who had brought him in had spoken in hushed, almost reverent tones about the capture. It had taken 12 men, multiple lassos, and the better part of a day to bring him down. Even then, he had fought with such ferocity that 2 horses had been injured, and 1 cowboy had suffered a broken arm. They had hoped to break him, to add him to the string of horses that would eventually be sold to the cavalry or to wealthy ranchers who prized strong, intelligent mounts. Instead, they had created a legend of terror. Every attempt to approach the horse had ended in disaster. He had kicked down 3 separate pen walls, trampled 2 would-be trainers, and sent every cowboy who dared enter his enclosure scrambling for safety. The broken rope that now hung from the corner post of his pen had belonged to Jake Morrison, the town's most experienced horsebreaker, who had confidently entered the corral with plans to show the Mustang who was boss. He had emerged minutes later, rope severed, hat lost, and dignity thoroughly trampled along with his carefully laid plans. Word of the horse's impossible nature had spread throughout the territory. Horsebreakers from as far as Tucson had come to try their luck, drawn by the promise of fame and the substantial bounty that had been placed on successfully breaking the animal. Each had left defeated, and some had left injured. The Mustang seemed to grow more dangerous with each failed attempt, as if the violence only reinforced his determination never to surrender. The economic impact on Cedar Ridge had been swift and devastating. Cattle drives began avoiding the town, unwilling to risk their herds near an animal that seemed capable of spooking entire groups of cattle into stampeding. The stockyard's reputation had changed from that of a reliable way station to a place of chaos and unpredictability. Local ranchers had stopped bringing their horses for training or trading, and the steady income that had kept the town alive was drying up like water in the desert sun. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man whose weathered face told the story of 30 years, spent keeping peace in frontier towns, found himself facing a problem unlike any he had encountered in his long career. How do you arrest a horse? How do you reason with an animal that seemed to embody pure, untamed fury? The town council met weekly now, their discussions growing more heated as solutions proved elusive. Some called for the horse to be shot. Others insisted that such a magnificent animal deserved a chance at redemption. The arguments had begun to divide the community, with neighbors taking sides and tempers fraying in the summer heat. Into this tense atmosphere walked Dasheen, though few noticed his arrival at first. He came on foot, leading a pack mule laden with simple belongings, his approach so quiet that he seemed to materialize rather than arrive. He was a man in his middle 50s, with long gray hair braided with strips of leather and beads that caught the morning light. His face was deeply lined, each wrinkle a testament to years spent under the harsh southwestern sun, but his dark eyes held a depth of understanding that spoke of wisdom earned through hardship. He wore simple clothes-worn leather pants, a cotton shirt bleached nearly white by age and sun, and moccasins that made no sound as he walked down the dusty main street. Around his neck hung a small leather pouch, darkened by years of handling, which those with knowledge of Apache ways would recognize as a medicine bag. His movements were deliberate and economical, speaking of a man who had learned that every gesture should have purpose. The townspeople watched him with the mixture of curiosity and wariness that frontier communities reserved for strangers, especially Indian strangers. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, drawn by the quiet dignity of his presence, but cautioned by their parents' nervous glances. Men paused in their work to observe his progress, hands unconsciously moving to rest on gun belts or tool handles. Old habits dying hard in a land where trust was earned slowly and suspicion came naturally. Dasheen seemed unbothered by the attention, his gaze taking in the details of the town with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to assess places and people quickly. He noted the nervous energy that hung over Cedar Ridge like a dust cloud, the way conversation stopped when he passed, the subtle signs of a community under stress. But what drew his attention most powerfully was the sound that carried on the desert wind, the thunderous pounding of hooves against wood, the crash of metal against rail, the unmistakable sounds of a creature in torment. He followed the sound to the stockyards, where a small crowd had gathered to watch the daily spectacle that had become as regular as sunrise. In the largest corral, the brown Mustang raged against his confinement, his powerful body in constant motion, his eyes wild with an anger that seemed to burn like fire. The fence rails bore the scars of his fury: splintered wood, bent metal, and the accumulated damage of 3 months of relentless rebellion. As Dasheen approached the edge of the crowd, the horse suddenly stilled, his great head turning toward the newcomer with an alertness that made several onlookers step back instinctively. For a moment that seemed to stretch like a held breath, man and horse regarded each other across the dusty space that separated them. In that instant, something passed between them, not understanding, not yet, but recognition. Recognition of loss, of pain, of spirits that had been tested by forces beyond their control. The crowd began to murmur, sensing that something significant had just occurred, though few could name what they had witnessed. The horse's ears pricked forward, no longer flattened against his skull in perpetual anger. His posture remained alert, ready for flight or fight, but the wild fury that had defined his every moment seemed to pause, as if he too had recognized something familiar in the weathered Apache warrior who stood watching him with quiet understanding eyes. Dasheen said nothing, made no move toward the corral, offered no commentary on what he had observed. He simply stood and watched, his presence as still and patient as the desert stones, while inside his chest, something that had been frozen. Since the day he lost his son began to stir with the first faint warmth of purpose. The medicine pouch against his chest seemed to grow heavier, as if the sacred items within were awakening to the possibility of healing, not just for himself, but for this magnificent creature who, like him, had been wounded by a world that seemed to offer only violence and loss. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and still Dasheen stood and watched. The crowd gradually dispersed, drawn away by the demands of daily life. But the Apache warrior remained, patient as time itself. While the brown Mustang paced his prison and two damaged souls began the slow, careful process of recognizing kindred. Spirits in a world that had taught them both to trust no one. The incident that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning, when the desert air hung still and heavy with the promise of another scorching day. Young Billy Patterson, barely 19 and full of the kind of confidence that comes from having never truly failed at anything, had arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 days earlier with dreams of making a name for himself as a horsebreaker. He had heard stories about the untamable Mustang, but like many young men, he believed that previous failures simply meant that the right man hadn't yet attempted the job. Billy was the son of a successful rancher from Texas, blessed with natural ability around horses and cursed with the arrogance that often accompanies early success. He had broken his first bronco at age 14 and had never met a horse he couldn't eventually ride. The fact that more experienced men had failed only convinced him that they lacked his particular combination of skill and determination. Dasheen had been maintaining his quiet vigil at the stockyards for 5 days, arriving each morning before dawn and remaining until the desert stars began to show themselves in the darkening sky. He spoke to no one and made no attempts to approach the Mustang, but his presence had become as much a part of the daily rhythm as the sunrise itself. The horse had grown accustomed to the Apache warrior's silent presence, no longer displaying the explosive fury that had characterized his every waking moment. Instead, there was a watchful tension, as if the Mustang was trying to solve a puzzle that had never been presented to him before. On this particular morning, Billy Patterson strode into the stockyards with the swagger of youth and the certainty of the untested. He carried a new rope, coiled with precision, and wore spurs that caught the morning light with each confident step. Behind him trailed a small group of townspeople who had been drawn by his boastful promises of the previous evening, when he had loudly declared in the saloon that he would have the horse broken and ready for sale by noon. Sheriff Bradley had tried to dissuade the young man, sharing accounts of previous attempts and the injuries that had resulted. But Billy had dismissed these warnings with the wave of a hand and the kind of laugh that only comes from someone who has never experienced genuine failure. Dr. Harrison, the town's physician, had quietly positioned himself where he could observe the proceedings, his medical bag close at hand and his expression suggesting he expected to have need of it. Dasheen watched from his usual position, near the corner post where the broken rope still hung as a testament to previous failures. His dark eyes took in every detail of the young cowboy's preparation, knowing the way Billy moved with the unconscious grace of someone born to work with horses, but also observing the tension in his shoulders that spoke of adrenaline and perhaps the first whisper of doubt. The Mustang had positioned himself at the far end of the corral, his magnificent head raised high and his nostrils flared as he tested the wind for the scent of this new challenger. His brown coat gleamed in the morning sun, every muscle defined and ready for whatever battle was about to commence. His eyes, intelligent and wary, fixed on Billy with an intensity that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably. Billy entered the corral with his rope ready and his spurs chiming a metallic rhythm against the hard-packed earth. For a moment, man and horse faced each other across the dusty space, each taking the measure of the other. Then Billy began to move. his rope singing through the air in perfect loops as he attempted to position himself for the throw that would begin the contest. The Mustang's response was immediate and devastating. He erupted into motion with a violence that caught even the experienced onlookers by surprise, his powerful hindquarters propelling him forward with the speed of lightning and the force of thunder. Billy, to his credit, managed to get his rope around the horse's neck, but the victory was short-lived. The Mustang reared, his front hooves pawing the air like weapons, then crashed down and spun with such suddenness that Billy lost his footing. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of an avalanche. The rope, pulled taut between horse and man, snapped with a crack like a gunshot. Billy, thrown off balance by the sudden release of tension, stumbled backward just as the Mustang charged. The horse's shoulder caught the young cowboy in the chest, sending him flying through the air to land with a sickening thud against the far fence. The crowd erupted in shouts of alarm as Dr. Harrison rushed forward, his bag already open and his mind calculating the extent of injuries. Even before he reached the motionless figure, Billy lay crumpled against the fence posts, his left arm bent at an angle that made seasoned cowboys wince, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead where he had struck the wood. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and when the doctor gently examined him, it became clear that several ribs had been broken in the impact. The Mustang, meanwhile, had retreated to the center of the corral, his sides heaving not from exertion, but from the fury that coursed through his powerful frame. The bloodied bandana that Billy had worn around his neck lay trampled in the dust, a stark reminder of how quickly confidence could turn to catastrophe. The horse stood there like a brown statue of defiance, his head high and his eyes blazing, with an anger that seemed to burn hotter with each failed attempt to break his spirit. As Dr. Harrison supervised Billy's careful removal from the corral on a makeshift stretcher, the crowd began to disperse, their excited chatter replaced by the subdued murmurs of people who had witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. Some shook their heads in dismay, others muttered about the devil being in that horse, and a few cast nervous glances toward Dasheen, as if his quiet presence had somehow contributed to the morning's disaster. Sheriff Bradley approached the Apache warrior as the last of the crowd drifted away, his weathered face etched with concern and frustration. "You've been watching this horse for days now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had run out of solutions. "You got any ideas about what we're supposed to do with him? That boy could have been killed, and the next one might not be so lucky." Dasheen turned his dark eyes toward the sheriff, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried a gravity that made Bradley lean closer to hear. "Some things cannot be broken," he said simply. "They can only be understood." The sheriff frowned, clearly frustrated by what seemed like cryptic philosophy in the face of a very practical problem. "Understanding won't pay the town's bills or keep folks safe," he replied. "The town council's meeting tonight, and there's going to be serious talk about putting that horse down. We can't have him hurting people." Dasheen nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the Mustang, who had moved to the water trough and was drinking deeply, his ears still alert for any sign of new threats. "Fear makes men do foolish things," the Apache warrior observed. "It makes them see enemies where there might be friends." That evening, as promised, the town council convened in the back room of the general store, the air thick with tobacco smoke and tension. The arguments that erupted were passionate and divided. Some council members, led by the banker Marcus Whitmore, insisted that the horse represented a clear and present danger that could no longer be tolerated. Others, including several of the women who had witnessed the morning's events, argued that destroying such a magnificent animal would be a tragedy that would haunt the town forever. The debate raged for hours, voices rising as positions hardened, and tempers flared. Proposals ranged from shipping the horse to a distant ranch where he could live out his days in isolation, to hiring professional marksmen to end the problem permanently. Through it all, The sound of the Mustang's restless pacing could be heard through the store's thin walls, a constant reminder of the creature at the center of their deliberations. As the meeting finally began to wind down, with no clear resolution in sight, Sarah McKenna, the widowed owner of the general store, spoke up from the corner where she had been quietly listening. "What about the Apache man?" she asked, her voice cutting through the tired arguments like a cool breeze. "He seems to understand something about that horse that the rest of us don't. Maybe we should ask him what he thinks before we make any final decisions." The suggestion was met with skeptical silence, but Sheriff Bradley, desperate for any alternative to the increasingly likely prospect of having to shoot the magnificent animal, agreed to approach Dasheen the following morning. As the council members filed out into the desert night, the Mustang's hoofbeats continued their restless rhythm, and somewhere in the darkness, an Apache warrior sat beneath the stars, holding his medicine pouch and thinking about understanding, healing, and the long road that sometimes lay between the two. Sheriff Bradley found Dasheen at dawn, sitting cross-legged on a warm blanket near the stockyard fence, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. The Apache warrior's presence had become as reliable as sunrise itself, but this was the first time the sheriff had approached him directly since their brief conversation the previous day. "Mind if I sit?" Bradley asked, gesturing toward the ground beside the blanket. Dasheen nodded without speaking, his dark eyes remaining fixed on the Mustang, who stood at the far end of the corral with his head raised, testing the morning wind. The horse had grown accustomed to the Apache's daily presence, but his wariness remained absolute, ready to explode into violence at the first sign of threat. "The town council's ready to have that horse shot," Bradley said after settling himself on the hard-packed earth. "Can't say I blame them after what happened to young Patterson. But Sarah McKenna suggested I talk to you first. She seems to think you might have some ideas." Dasheen was quiet for so long that the sheriff began to wonder if he intended to respond at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried the weight of deep conviction. "My father taught me that horses are sacred beings," he said. "They carry the spirits of the wind and the memories of all the places they have run free. To kill this one would be to silence a song that the world needs to hear." Bradley frowned, struggling to reconcile poetic philosophy with practical concerns. "That's a beautiful sentiment," he said carefully. "But this particular horse nearly killed someone yesterday. How do we balance respect for animals with keeping people safe?" For the first time since the sheriff's arrival, Dasheen turned to look at him directly. His eyes held depths that spoke of experiences Bradley could only imagine. "Tell me," Dasheen said, "when a man is angry and dangerous, do you kill him? Or do you try to understand what made him that way?" The comparison caught Bradley off guard. He had spent 30 years dealing with angry, dangerous men, and while some had indeed met violent ends, his proudest achievements had come from finding ways to diffuse situations without bloodshed. "I try to understand," he admitted. "But this is a horse, not a man. You can't reason with an animal. Cannot?" Dasheen's weathered features shifted into what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Or will not try." From that day forward, Dasheen's routine expanded beyond simple observation. He began arriving at the stockyards before dawn, carrying a small leather pouch filled with grain and another containing fresh water from the stream that ran north of town. He would set these offerings at a precise distance from the corral fence, close enough to show intention, far enough to avoid triggering the horse's defensive responses. The Mustang noticed these gifts immediately, his intelligent eyes tracking every movement as Dasheen placed them with careful ceremony. For the first 3 days, the horse refused to approach the offerings, viewing them with the deep suspicion of a creature that had learned to trust nothing that came from human hands. But hunger and thirst are powerful motivators, and on the 4th morning, Dasheen arrived to find the grain scattered and the water gone. Word of this small development spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed that news travels in small communities. Some townspeople scoffed at the idea that leaving food for the horse represented any kind of progress. Others, particularly those who had witnessed the daily escalation of the Mustang's fury, began to notice that the animal seemed marginally calmer. His constant pacing replaced by periods of watchful stillness. It was during one of these quiet moments that Sarah McKenna first approached the stockyards. She had been watching from her store's back window as Dasheen maintained his patient vigil, and curiosity had finally overcome her natural caution. She was a woman in her early 40s, with prematurely gray hair that she wore pinned back in a practical style, and hands that showed the calluses of someone who had worked hard all her life. "You're very patient," she observed, settling herself on an upturned crate, a respectful distance from Dasheen's blanket. "Patience is the beginning of all healing," he replied without taking his eyes from the horse. "My people know this. Your people seem to have forgotten." Sarah studied his profile, noting the deep lines around his eyes and the way his hands rested easily on his knees, free of the tension that seemed to grip most men in these uncertain times. "You've lost someone," she said quietly. "It wasn't of us." Question. Dasheen's stillness became even more profound, if such a thing were possible. For a long moment, the only sounds were the distant calls of ravens and the soft shuffle of the Mustang's hooves in the dust. When he finally spoke, his voice carried pain worn smooth by time, like river stones polished by endless flowing water. "My son," he said simply. He was 22 winters old. "Brave, like this horse. Angry, like this horse. Dead, unlike this horse." Sarah felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She had lost her own husband 3 years earlier when a heart attack felled him in their store's back room, and she recognized the particular quality of grief that Dasheen carried. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it in a way that transcended mere politeness. "He died because men feared what they did not understand," Dasheen continued, his words flowing like water finding its path downhill. "Because angry men with guns decided that being different was the same as being dangerous. I could not save him. Perhaps I can save this one." From his shirt pocket, Dasheen withdrew a single eagle feather, its pristine white marked with bands of brown and black. He held it reverently, turning it slowly in the morning light. "My son gave this to me before his last hunt," he explained. "He said it would keep me safe. Instead, it keeps his memory alive." Sarah watched as he carefully tucked the feather back into his pocket, understanding instinctively that she had been privileged to witness something sacred. "What was his name?" she asked. "Running Bear," Dasheen replied. "He loved horses more than anything else in this world. Would sit for hours just watching them, learning their ways." He said they spoke to him in languages older than words. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the Mustang lifted his great head and looked directly at Dasheen for the first time since the Apache warrior had begun his vigil. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fragile as morning mist. Then the horse took a single step forward, stopped, and took another. Sarah held her breath, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever spell was being woven in the dusty corral. The Mustang approached the fence with infinite caution, each step considered and deliberate. When he reached the rails, he stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Dasheen with an intensity that seemed almost human in its complexity. Slowly, moving with the careful grace of someone who understood the fragility of trust, Dasheen rose from his sitting position and approached the fence. The Mustang tensed but did not flee. For several heartbeats, man and horse regarded each other across the barrier of wood and wire, two damaged souls recognizing something fundamental in each other's pain. Then Dasheen began to speak, his voice so low that Sarah had to strain to hear the words. He spoke in Apache, the liquid syllables flowing like water over stones, and though she could not understand the language, she could feel the power in it. The Mustang's ears pricked forward, and his head cocked slightly to one side, as if he too was struggling to comprehend something just beyond his grasp. When Dasheen finally fell silent, the Mustang remained at the fence for several more minutes, before turning and walking slowly back to the center of the corral. But something had changed. The constant tension that had defined his every movement for 3 months had eased, replaced by a watchful calm that spoke of possibility. Rather than perpetual rage. The music began on the 7th day of Dasheen's vigil, emerging from the pre-dawn darkness like a prayer made manifest. Sarah, arriving early to open her store, heard the haunting melody drifting from the stockyards and found herself drawn toward the sound despite her morning responsibilities. She discovered Dasheen sitting in his usual place, but now he held a wooden flute to his lips, his weathered fingers moving across its holes with practiced grace. The instrument was clearly handmade, carved from what appeared to be cedar and darkened by years of handling. Its surface bore intricate patterns that caught the early light, symbols and designs that spoke of traditions older than any written history. But it was the music itself that stopped Sarah in her tracks, notes that seemed to capture the vast loneliness of the desert and transform it into something beautiful and profound. The Mustang stood at the fence closest to Dasheen, his great head lowered and his ears pricked forward in an attitude of listening that the horse had never displayed before. His breathing had synchronized with the rhythm of the music, deep and regular, and for the first time since his capture, his powerful frame appeared truly relaxed. "It was my son's," Dasheen explained when he noticed Sarah's approach, lowering the flute but keeping it cradled gently in his hands. "I made it for him when he reached his 15th year. He played it often, said it helped him speak to the spirits of the animals." Sarah settled onto her familiar crate, moving slowly so as not to disturb the peaceful atmosphere that the music had created. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "I've never heard anything quite like it." Running Bear was gifted, Dasheen continued, his thumb tracing the carved patterns on the flute's surface. He could play songs that would calm the wildest stallion or call deer from the deepest forest. The elders said he had been blessed by the spirits of harmony. His voice grew heavy with memory. "I taught him to carve, but the music came from somewhere deeper than learning." The Mustang nickered softly, a sound so unexpected that both humans turned to look at him in surprise. The horse was regarding the flute with what could only be described as interest, his dark eyes fixed on the instrument as if it held secrets he was eager to unlock. "He remembers," Dasheen murmured, raising the flute to his lips once more. "Music speaks to the parts of us that words cannot reach." As the melody resumed, Sarah found herself transported to memories of her own evenings spent listening to her husband's harmonica, the lullabies she had hummed to the children they had never been blessed to have, the songs that had sustained her through the long nights after his death. There was something universal in Dasheen's music, something that reached across cultures and spoke to the fundamental human need for beauty in a harsh world. Over the following days, the morning concerts became a regular part of life in Cedar Ridge. Word spread quickly through the small community, and soon Sarah found herself joined by other early risers drawn by the haunting melodies. Children began arriving with their parents, their young faces filled with wonder as they watched the fearsome Mustang stand peacefully at the fence, apparently entranced by the music. It was during one of these gatherings that old Martha Henderson, the town's unofficial historian and gossip, approached Sarah with questions that had been building in the community's collective consciousness. "What do you know about him?" she asked, nodding toward Dasheen. "About his past, I mean. Tom Bradley says he appeared out of nowhere, but men like that don't just materialize from the desert." Sarah realized that despite the hours she had spent in Dasheen's company, she knew remarkably little about his background beyond the tragic loss of his son. "He doesn't speak much about himself," she admitted, but you can see in his eyes that he's carried more than his share of sorrow. Apache warriors don't usually wander alone, Martha observed, her tone carrying the weight of someone who had lived through decades of frontier conflict. They travel with their people, their families. For him to be here by himself, something significant must have happened. That evening, as the desert cooled and the stars began their nightly emergence, Sarah found the courage to ask Dasheen directly about his past. They sat together on the porch of her store, sharing a simple dinner of bread and preserved meat, the Mustang visible in his corral as a dark silhouette against the deepening sky. "Martha Henderson thinks you're running from something," Sarah said carefully, watching his face for any sign of defensiveness or withdrawal. Dasheen was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where the last light of day painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one carried a weight that made them difficult to lift. "Running Bear was killed by cavalry soldiers," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They came to our camp claiming to search for stolen horses. Found nothing, but stayed anyway, drinking our water, eating our food, treating our people with disrespect." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the porch with enough force to make the wood creak. "My son could not watch his grandmother be pushed aside by drunken men." He spoke up, defended her honor. "They shot him for his courage." Sarah felt her heart clench with sympathetic pain. "What did you do?" "What any father would do," Dasheen replied. "I prepared for war, gathered weapons, called upon the other warriors, planned revenge that would make the earth run red with blood." His voice grew heavy with self-recrimination. "But my wife, wise woman that she was, saw the path I was choosing. She said that killing more young men would not bring our son back, would only create more mothers who would weep as she wept. So you left?" "I went into the mountains to think, to pray, to ask the spirits what path I should walk. When I came back, 3 months later, I found that my wife had died of the grief I left her alone to carry. The tribe had moved on, following the seasons as our people always have. I was alone, and I realized that my anger had cost me everything I had left to lose." Sarah reached out and covered his weathered hand with her own, a gesture that surprised them both with its naturalness. "And now?" Dasheen turned his hand palm up, allowing their fingers to intertwine. "Now, I am learning that healing sometimes comes disguised as the very thing that caused the wound. That horse carries the same rage I carried, the same pain that comes from losing everything that matters. Perhaps by helping him find peace, I can find it myself." The Mustang's soft whinny drifted across the evening air, and they turned to see him standing at the fence, his silhouette proud and alert against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would bring another day of patient music, gentle offerings, and the slow, careful work of building trust between damaged souls. But tonight, as Sarah and Dasheen sat together in comfortable silence, both felt the first stirrings of something that had been absent from their lives for far too long. The possibility that tomorrow might hold more hope than sorrow. The breakthrough came on a morning when the desert air shimmered with heat mirages and the Mustang stood motionless at the fence, his great brown head lowered as Dasheen played a particularly mournful melody on his son's flute. Sarah had arrived early, as had become her custom, and together they watched as something extraordinary unfolded before their eyes. Without conscious thought, Dasheen rose from his sitting position and approached the fence, still playing. The Mustang remained perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the Apache warrior's face with an intensity that spoke of recognition deeper than mere familiarity. When Dasheen reached the wooden rails, he slowly extended his free hand, palm up, fingers relaxed and unthreatening. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, man and horse regarded each other across the barrier that had defined their relationship for weeks. Then, with infinite caution, the Mustang lowered his massive head and touched his velvet muzzle to Dasheen's weathered palm. The contact lasted only seconds before the horse pulled back, but the significance of the moment sent ripples of excitement through the small crowd that had gathered to witness the morning's music. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, recognizing that she had just observed something sacred, the first tentative bridge built between two souls that had learned to trust nothing and no one. "Well, I'll be damned," breathed Sheriff Bradley, who had arrived just in time to witness the historic moment. "I've never seen anything like that in 30 years of keeping peace on the frontier." Word of the contact spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed of wildfire, bringing curious onlookers and skeptics in equal measure. By noon, the stockyards had attracted the largest crowd since the Mustang's arrival 3 months earlier. Some came seeking proof that the stories were true, others hoping to witness another miracle, and a few arriving with the cynical expectation that the whole thing had been exaggerated in the telling. Among the newcomers was Dr. Harrison, who had treated young Billy Patterson and remained fascinated by the psychology of what he was witnessing. "There's more happening here than simple animal training," he confided to Sarah as they watched Dasheen maintain his patient vigil. "That horse has been displaying classic symptoms of what we might call severe trauma. The fact that he's beginning to trust again suggests a level of healing that goes far beyond the physical." Dr. Harrison's observations proved prophetic over the following days, as the changes in the Mustang became increasingly apparent to anyone with eyes to see. The constant pacing that had characterized his behavior since capture gave way to periods of calm observation. His aggressive posturing toward other horses in nearby pens softened into curious interest. Most remarkably, the explosive fury that had defined his response to human presence began to transform into something approaching acceptance. It was during this period of gradual progress that Sheriff Bradley finally shared what he had learned about the Mustang's origins. The information had come from a cavalry scout named Peterson, who had tracked down the Apache warrior one afternoon with a story that shed new light on the horse's past. "That Brown's got more reason than most to hate people," Peterson had explained, his weathered face grim with the memory. He was the lead stallion of a wild herd that was grazing in Willow Canyon, about 40 miles north of here. Beautiful sight. They say maybe 20 horses running free as the wind. But the canyon was needed for a railroad survey, and the company wanted them cleared out. The cavalry had been called in to scatter the herd, Peterson continued, but what should have been a simple roundup had turned into something far more tragic. A young lieutenant, eager to prove himself, had ordered his men to drive the horses toward a box canyon where they could be easily captured. But the terrain had proven treacherous, and in the chaos that followed, most of the herd had been lost, some to rifle fire, others to the deadly fall from the canyon rim when they chose death over captivity. That brown stallion saw his family die, Peterson concluded, his voice heavy with the weight of unnecessary tragedy. Watched his mares and foals go down under the guns, then fought like a demon when they finally cornered him. Took 8 ropes to bring him down, and even then he never stopped fighting. Man would have to be blind not to see that he's carrying more than just wildness. He's carrying grief. When Sheriff Bradley shared this story with Dasheen, the Apache warrior listened in silence, his dark eyes growing distant as if he were seeing events that had occurred long before his arrival in Cedar Ridge. Around his wrist, he wore a braided bracelet made from horsehair black and brown strands woven together in a pattern that spoke of Apache tradition and personal meaning. "My own horses," Dasheen said quietly, noting Sarah's curious glance at the bracelet. "Killed in the same raid that took my son. I cut their hair before the soldiers burned their bodies, wove it into this to keep their spirits close to me." He turned the bracelet slowly, his weathered fingers tracing the intricate pattern. "Hair holds memory, my grandmother taught me. As long as we remember, the spirits of those we love never truly die." The parallel between Dasheen's loss and the Mustang's tragedy was not lost on anyone who heard both stories. Here were two beings who had watched their families destroyed by human violence, who had survived when others had not, and who carried the burden of that survival like a weight that threatened to crush their spirits. Sarah found herself thinking about these connections as she watched Dasheen work with increasing patience and gentleness to build trust with the traumatized horse. There was something profound happening in the dusty corral that went far beyond simple animal training. This was healing work. She realized the kind of deep, spiritual restoration that could only happen when two damaged souls recognized their common ground. The breakthrough to physical contact opened new possibilities in their relationship. Dasheen began spending longer periods at the fence, sometimes reaching through the rails to gently stroke the Mustang's neck or shoulder. The horse, in turn, began seeking out these moments of connection, approaching the fence whenever the Apache's warrior appeared, and standing patiently for the gentle contact that seemed to ease something deep within his troubled spirit. Other horses in the stockyards began to take notice of the transformation occurring in their midst. The constant agitation that had characterized the entire facility during the Mustang's reign of terror gave way to a calmer atmosphere. Horses that had been skittish and difficult to handle began responding more readily to their handlers, as if the peace that Dasheen was bringing to one troubled animal was somehow radiating outward to affect the entire environment. The townspeople, too, began to change their perspectives. What had started as a problem to be solved, a dangerous animal that threatened their community's safety and economic stability, was transforming into something approaching a miracle. Conversations that had once centered on fear and frustration now carried notes of wonder and hope. Children began asking their parents if they could visit the stockyards to hear the music and watch the gentle interaction between the Apache warrior and the horse that no one had been able to tame. Elderly residents shared stories of their own experiences with difficult animals, and more than one admitted that they had never considered the possibility that patience and understanding might accomplish what force and dominance had failed to achieve. But not everyone in Cedar Ridge welcomed these developments. Among the skeptics was Harold Morrison, a wealthy rancher whose spread lay 20 miles south of town and whose influence in territorial politics gave him considerable sway over local affairs. Morrison had been watching the situation with growing concern, though his motivations remained unclear to most observers. Unlike the other townspeople, Morrison seemed less interested in the welfare of the horse than in the implications of what Dasheen was accomplishing. There was something in his pale blue eyes that suggested recognition when he looked at the Apache warrior, though he had never approached Dasheen directly or acknowledged any previous acquaintance. As the days passed and the bond between man and horse continued to strengthen, Morrison's presence at the stockyards became more frequent and his demeanor more agitated. He would stand at the edge of the crowd that gathered for the morning concerts, his weathered hands clenched into fists and his expression dark with some private anger that no one else could fathom. The sacred sage ceremony took place on a morning when the desert air hung still and heavy with the promise of rain, the first such promise the region had seen in weeks. Dasheen had risen before dawn to gather the plants he needed from the hills north of town, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the silent grace of someone who had learned to read the landscape by starlight and instinct. Sarah found him at the stockyards as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. He knelt beside a small fire that sent thin tendrils of aromatic smoke spiraling into the morning air, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision as he prepared bundles of sage, sweetgrass, and other plants whose names she did not know, but whose purpose she was beginning to understand. "This is about cleansing," Dasheen explained as Sarah settled onto her familiar crate, his voice carrying the reverent tone of someone engaged in sacred work. "The spirits of anger and fear cling to living beings like smoke clings to clothing. They must be washed away before healing can truly begin. The Mustang stood at the fence watching these preparations with an alertness that spoke of deep curiosity, rather than suspicion. His great brown head turned to follow Dasheen's movements, and his nostrils flared as he tested the unfamiliar scents that drifted on the morning breeze. There was something almost ceremonial in his posture, as if some ancestral memory was stirring within him, recognizing patterns older than any human memory. Word of the ceremony had spread through Cedar Ridge during the night, carried by the mysterious communication network that connects small communities like an invisible web. By the time Dasheen was ready to begin, a respectful crowd had gathered, some drawn by curiosity, others by a deeper sense that they were about to witness something significant. Sheriff Bradley stood near the back of the group, his weathered face reflecting the internal struggle between his practical law enforcement training and his growing recognition that what Dasheen was accomplishing transcended any category of problem-solving he had previously encountered. Beside him, Dr. Harrison watched with the fascination of a man whose scientific education had not prepared him for the complexities of spiritual healing. "My grandmother taught me these ways," Dasheen said, rising from beside the fire with a burning bundle of sage in his hands. "She said that all healing begins with acknowledgement, recognizing the wounds that have been inflicted, and asking the spirits for permission to begin the work of restoration." As he approached the corral gate, several people in the crowd shifted nervously. Even after weeks of progress, the memory of the Mustang's violence remained fresh in their minds, and the idea of Dasheen entering the enclosure still seemed fraught with danger. But the Apache warrior moved with the calm confidence of someone who had moved beyond fear into a realm of deeper understanding. The Mustang watched his approach without retreating, his powerful frame alert but relaxed, his dark eyes fixed on Dasheen's face with an intensity that suggested recognition of the ceremony's significance. When Dasheen reached for the gate latch, the horse took several steps forward, positioning himself near the fence as if presenting himself for whatever ritual was about to unfold. The gate swung open with a creak that seemed unusually loud in the morning stillness, and for the first time since his capture, the Mustang had an unobstructed path to freedom. Yet he made no move to bolt, instead standing perfectly still as Dasheen entered his domain carrying the smoking sage bundle like a torch of purification. What happened next would be remembered and retold in Cedar Ridge for generations to come. Dasheen moved around the horse in a slow, ceremonial circle, allowing the sage smoke to wash over the powerful brown body while chanting in Apache, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to match the natural cadences of wind and water. The Mustang stood as if rooted to the earth, his breathing deep and regular, his eyes half closed in what appeared to be a state of profound relaxation. As the ceremony continued, other horses in nearby corrals began to respond to the ritual unfolding before them. Several moved to the sides of their enclosures closest to the Mustang's pen, standing quietly as if they too wished to partake in whatever healing was being offered. The entire stockyard took on an atmosphere of hushed reverence, broken only by the soft chanting and the gentle whisper of smoke rising into the brightening sky. "He's washing away the anger," Sarah whispered to Dr. Harrison, her voice filled with wonder as she watched the transformation taking place before her eyes. "Look at the horse's expression. He's letting go of something." Dr. Harrison nodded, his scientific skepticism crumbling in the face of what he was witnessing. "I've studied trauma in human patients for 15 years, he murmured back, "and I've never seen anything quite like this. There's a psychological release happening that goes beyond anything in my medical training." As the ceremony drew to its conclusion, Dasheen extinguished the sage bundle and approached the Mustang directly, moving slowly but without hesitation. The horse lowered his great head, allowing the Apache warrior to place both hands on his neck, in a gesture that was part blessing, part communion. For several heartbeats, they stood connected in perfect stillness, two beings who had found in each other a reflection of their own capacity for healing. The crowd watched in amazed silence As Dasheen stepped back and the Mustang, instead of returning to his usual position at the far end of the corral, followed him toward the gate. When Dasheen exited the enclosure, the horse remained at the fence, his muzzle extended through the rails, as if seeking continued contact with the man who had just performed this act of spiritual restoration. "I'll be damned," Sheriff Bradley said for the second time in as many weeks, shaking his head in wonderment. "If someone had told me a month ago that I'd see that horse standing calm as a Sunday morning while an Apache warrior performed Indian ceremonies around him, I'd have checked them for fever." But not everyone in the crowd shared the sheriff's amazement or approval. Harold Morrison had positioned himself at the edge of the gathering, and his face reflected none of the wonder that was evident in most of the other observers. Instead, his pale blue eyes held a hardness that spoke of anger carefully controlled and resentment long nurtured. "Lot of heathen nonsense, if you ask me," Morrison muttered to no one in particular, his voice carrying just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Man's got no business filling these people's heads with Indian superstitions. What's next war dances in the town square?" Sarah turned to face him, her usually gentle demeanor sharpening with protective instinct. "What I see," she said clearly, "is a man who's accomplished something the rest of us couldn't manage with all our modern methods as superior attitudes. Maybe there's wisdom in those superstitions that we do well to consider." Morrison's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention back to the corral. The Mustang had begun to pace again, but this movement was different from his previous agitation. Instead of the desperate, angry circuit that had characterized his behavior for months, this was a flowing, almost dancing gait that spoke of energy released rather than contained. "He's celebrating," Dasheen observed, his voice carrying satisfaction and deep joy. "The spirits of his family have been honored, and their blessing has been given for him to live without the burden of their loss." As if to confirm this interpretation, the Mustang suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves pawing the air in a display of magnificent power that drew gasps from the crowd. But where such behavior had once been threatening, this felt like pure expression, a creature reclaiming his right to beauty and strength and life. "Harold." Morrison turned and walked away from the gathering, his shoulders rigid with some private anger. But his departure went largely unnoticed. Most of the crowd remained to watch as Dasheen began the slow process of grooming the Mustang through the fence rails, his gentle hands working through the tangled mane while the horse stood perfectly still, accepting this gift of care with the dignity of a king receiving tribute from a trusted advisor. The discovery came by accident, as the most significant revelations often do. Sarah had been organizing the cluttered back room of her general store, sorting through boxes of old papers and ledgers that her late husband had accumulated during his years as Cedar Ridge's unofficial record keeper. Most of the documents were routine business correspondence and inventory lists, but one particular wooden crate contained items that made her pause with growing unease. At first glance, the contents appeared to be military records, discharge papers, commendation letters, and photographs of men in cavalry uniforms. But as Sarah examined them more closely, she began to recognize names and places that connected to recent conversations around town. Among the papers was a detailed report written in a precise military hand, describing a pacification mission in Willow Canyon that had resulted in the dispersal of a hostile Indian horse herd. The signature at the bottom of the report made Sarah's blood run cold. Captain Harold Morrison, 7th Cavalry Regiment. With trembling hands, she spread the documents across her store counter, pieces of a puzzle that had been hidden in plain sight for months. The report was dated 3 years earlier and described, in clinical military language, the destruction of a wild horse herd that had been deemed a threat to railroad survey operations. But between the lines of official prose lay a story of unnecessary violence and casual brutality that made Sarah feel sick to her stomach. According to Morrison's own account, the mission had begun as a simple roundup operation designed to clear the canyon of wild horses. But the horses had proven more difficult to capture than anticipated, and Morrison had grown impatient with what he viewed as inefficient methods. Against the advice of his more experienced sergeants, he had ordered his men to drive the herd toward a box canyon, using rifle fire to motivate the animals. The result had been a massacre. Trapped between steep canyon walls and advancing cavalry, the horses had fought desperately for escape. Some had been shot outright. Others had chosen death over capture by leaping from the canyon rim. Only one, the lead stallion, had been taken alive, and only after sustaining multiple rope burns and what Morrison described as significant disciplinary action to break his resistance. But there was more. Hidden beneath the horse roundup report was another document that made Sarah's hands shake as she read it. This second report described a cavalry patrol's encounter with an Apache camp just 2 days after the horse roundup. The timing and location suggested that the same unit responsible for destroying the Mustang's herd had also been involved in the raid that had killed Dasheen's son. The official report claimed that the Apache camp had been harboring stolen military horses, and that resistance from the inhabitants had necessitated appropriate defensive measures. But reading between the lines of Morrison's carefully worded account, Sarah could see hints of a different story, one involving alcohol, provocative behavior by the cavalry soldiers, and a young Apache man who had died defending his grandmother's honor. As the full implications of her discovery began to sink in, Sarah realized that Harold Morrison was not simply another wealthy rancher with territorial influence. He was the architect of both tragedies that had shaped the lives of Dasheen and the Mustang. He was the common enemy that had destroyed their families and left them both carrying wounds that had never properly healed. But there was still more to uncover. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in oiled cloth, Sarah found a cavalry saber that bore Morrison's name engraved on its brass guard. The blade showed signs of use and careful maintenance, but what caught her attention was a series of small notches carved into the wooden handle marks that military men sometimes made to record significant actions or, in darker traditions, to count lives taken. The saber represented more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the violence that had shaped Morrison's approach to dealing with problems that could not be solved through political influence or economic pressure. It spoke of a man who had learned to see force as the first solution rather than the last resort, and who had never learned to value the lives of those he considered beneath his concern. That evening, as Sarah struggled with the decision of whether to share her discoveries, fate made the choice for her. Harold Morrison appeared at her store just as she was preparing to close, his presence filling the small space with an aura of barely controlled menace that she had never noticed before, but now recognized with crystal clarity. "Evening, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a false friendliness that did nothing to mask the hardness in his pale blue eyes. "I understand you've been asking questions about me around town. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in frontier communities, tends to lead people into situations they're not prepared to handle." Sarah forced herself to remain calm, though her heart was racing with the sudden recognition that she was alone with a man who had blood on his hands. "I'm not sure what you mean, Harold. I run a store, not a gossip mill." Morrison moved closer to the counter, and Sarah caught the scent of whiskey on his breath. "That Apache friend of yours has been filling people's heads with all sorts of romantic nonsense about understanding and healing. But some problems require more direct solutions, and some people need to be reminded of their place in the natural order of things." "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand exactly what Morrison meant. "I'm talking about a dangerous Indian who's been allowed to work his influence on a community that should know better," Morrison replied, his voice hardening. "I'm talking about a wild horse that represents a threat to public safety and should have been put down months ago. And I'm talking about a widow who might want to consider the consequences of supporting causes that run counter to the interests of law-abiding citizens. The threat was clear, though carefully couched in language that could be dismissed as concern, if repeated to others. But Sarah had spent enough years on the frontier to recognize dangerous men when she encountered them, and she realized that Morrison's interest in the situation went far beyond simple community concern. "You know him," she said suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "You know Dasheen from before he came to Cedar Ridge. You're afraid he might recognize you." Morrison's face went white, then flushed with anger as he realized that his carefully maintained facade was crumbling. "I don't know what you think you've discovered, but I'd advise you to be very careful about the conclusions you draw and the accusations you make. Men have faced serious consequences for spreading lies about their betters." But Sarah's fear was being replaced by righteous anger as she thought about Dasheen's gentle patience and the progress he had made with the traumatized Mustang. "They're not lies, are they? You were there when his son was killed. You were responsible for destroying that horse's family. You're the reason both of them carry the wounds they carry." Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt, a gesture that revealed more about his true nature than hours of conversation could have accomplished. "You're walking down a very dangerous path, woman. This territory has seen plenty of accidents befall people who couldn't mind their own business." "Get out of my store," Sarah said, her voice shaking but determined. "Get out now, before I call for Sheriff Bradley." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, his pale eyes calculating the risks and benefits of different courses of action. Finally, he turned toward the door, but paused with his hand on the latch. "That horse is going to be shot," he said quietly. "And that Indian is going to find himself facing charges that will see him removed from this community permanently. The only question is whether you want to be standing beside them when it happens." After Morrison left, Sarah sank into the chair behind her counter, her hand shaking as the full magnitude of the situation became clear. She was holding evidence that could expose Morrison's past crimes, but she was also facing a man who clearly had no qualms about using violence to protect his secrets. Dasheen and the Mustang had found each other across the gulf of their shared trauma, but the architect of that trauma was still present and still dangerous. As she sat in the gathering darkness of her store, surrounded by the evidence of Morrison's guilt, Sarah realized that the healing work Dasheen had begun was about to face its greatest test. The forces that had destroyed two families were still active in the world, and they would not allow their victims to find peace without a fight. Sarah spent the night in sleepless anguish, wrestling with the weight of her discovery and the terrible knowledge that Harold Morrison posed a direct threat to everything Dasheen had accomplished. By dawn, she had made her decision. Despite the personal risk, she had to warn Dasheen about the danger he faced and share the evidence that connected Morrison to both of their tragedies. She found the Apache warrior at the stockyards in his customary position, but something in his demeanor told her that the peaceful days of gradual progress were coming to an end. He sat perfectly still beside the Mustang's corral, but his stillness carried a tension that spoke of a predator preparing for conflict rather than a healer continuing his patient work. "You know," Sarah said as she approached, not bothering with preliminary greetings, "you recognize him." Dasheen turned his dark eyes toward her, and she saw in them depths of pain and anger that his gentle exterior had concealed for weeks. "Captain Morrison," he said quietly. "I would know that voice anywhere, though he has grown fat and soft in the years since he led the raid that killed my son." Sarah sank onto her familiar crate, her legs suddenly weak with the confirmation of her worst fears. "Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you confront him?" "Because confrontation changes nothing," Dasheen replied, his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees despite the storm she could see building in his eyes. "Dead sons do not return to life because their killers face justice. Broken hearts do not heal through revenge. I came here seeking peace, not to resume wars that should have ended long ago." But even as he spoke these words, Sarah could see the internal struggle that was tearing at him. The teachings of his people and the wisdom of his years counseled forgiveness and healing. But the father's heart that still grieved for Running Bear cried out for justice that had never come. "He's planning something," Sarah said urgently, sharing the details of Morrison's visit to her store and the thinly veiled threats he had made. "He sees what you've accomplished with the horse as a threat to his reputation, his standing in the community. Men like him can't allow challenges to their authority to go unanswered." Dasheen nodded slowly, his gaze turning to the Mustang, who stood alert at the fence as if sensing the tension that filled the morning air. "Spirit knows," he said, using the name he had begun calling the horse during their private moments together. "Animals understand danger in ways that humans have forgotten. He has been restless since yesterday, pacing and watching the horizon as if expecting enemies to appear." Indeed, the Mustang's behavior had changed noticeably over the past day. The peaceful acceptance that had characterized his response to Dasheen's presence had given way to a hyper-vigilant alertness that reminded Sarah of his first days in captivity. His ears constantly swiveled to catch sounds from beyond the stockyard, and his nostrils flared repeatedly as he tested the wind for threatening scents. "What will you do?" Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. "What I must," Dasheen replied, reaching into his shirt pocket to withdraw 4 smooth stones, each about the size of a silver dollar and worn smooth by countless years of handling. "My grandmother gave me these prayer stones when I became a warrior. Each one represents a direction and carries a prayer for strength, wisdom, courage, and peace." He held them in his cupped palms, their surfaces gleaming with a subtle luminescence in the morning light. "I had hoped never to have need of them again." As if summoned by their conversation, Sheriff Bradley appeared at the stockyards, his weathered face grim with news that neither Sarah nor Dasheen wanted to hear. "Morrison's been busy," he announced without preamble. "Spent yesterday evening visiting every member of the town council, filling their ears with stories about dangerous Indians and public safety threats. Called a special meeting for this afternoon, claiming he has new evidence that requires immediate action." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized how effectively Morrison was manipulating the community's residual fears and prejudices. Despite the progress Dasheen had made and the obvious transformation in the Mustang's behavior, it would be easy for a skilled manipulator to reframe the entire situation as a threat that required decisive action. "What kind of evidence?" Dasheen asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Claims he's found proof that you're planning some kind of uprising," Bradley replied, his disgust with the accusations evident in his voice. "Says the horse training is just a cover for gathering weapons and organizing local Indians against white settlers. It's all nonsense, of course, but Morrison's got political connections that reach all the way to the territorial capital." The sheriff paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "There's more. He's brought in witnesses, men who claim they saw you performing war dances and making threats against the community. I know it's all lies, but the council's scared, and scared people don't always make rational decisions." Sarah stood abruptly, her hands clenched into fists as righteous anger overcame her fear. "I have evidence," she declared. "Documents that prove Morrison was responsible for killing Dasheen's son and destroying the Mustang's herd. His own military reports, signed and dated." Sheriff Bradley's eyes widened with interest, but Dasheen raised a hand to forestall any immediate action. "Evidence of past crimes will not change present fears," he said with the sad wisdom of someone who had seen justice denied too many times. "Morrison knows this community, understands how to use their prejudices against me. He has prepared carefully for this moment." As if to emphasize the point, the sound of multiple riders approaching the stockyards reached their ears. A group of 5 men rode into view, their faces hard with purpose and their hands resting conspicuously on their weapons. At their head rode Morrison himself, his pale blue eyes scanning the scene with the calculating gaze of a predator who had cornered his prey. "Sheriff Bradley," Morrison called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm here with a legal warrant for the arrest of this Indian on charges of conspiracy to incite violence against the citizens of Cedar Ridge." "What warrant?" Bradley demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his own weapon. "I haven't issued any warrants, and I'm the duly appointed law enforcement authority in this county." Morrison reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document bearing official seals. "Territorial warrant, signed by Judge Morrison in Tucson. Takes precedence over local authority in matters involving potential Indian uprisings." Sarah felt the pieces of Morrison's plan clicking into place with sickening clarity. He had used his political connections to manufacture legal authority, created false witnesses to support his accusations, and timed everything to occur when the community was most vulnerable to manipulation by fear and prejudice. "And I suppose you have orders concerning the horse as well?" Dasheen asked, his voice remaining calm despite the obvious danger closing around him. "Dangerous animal, clearly unsuitable for training," Morrison replied with satisfaction. "Public safety requires immediate disposal. I've brought men qualified to handle the situation appropriately." The Mustang, who had been growing increasingly agitated as the conversation progressed, suddenly reared up on his hind legs, his powerful frame silhouetted against the morning sky like a statue of defiance carved from living bronze. His whinny of challenge echoed across the stockyards, and for a moment the assembled humans fell silent in the face of such magnificent fury. "He remembers you," Dasheen observed, noting how the horse's rage seemed focused specifically on Morrison. "Animals do not forget the scent of those who have caused them pain." Morrison's face twitched with what might have been fear or anger, but his voice remained steady as he addressed his men. "Dangerous animal, like I said. Take the Indian into custody and prepare to deal with the horse. We'll handle this by the book, but we'll handle it today." As Morrison's men began to spread out in a clearly rehearsed formation, Dasheen slowly rose to his feet, the prayer stone still cradled in his weathered palms. The morning sun caught the ancient symbols painted, on their surfaces representations of the 4 directions and the sacred forces that governed Apache spiritual life. "Before you act," Dasheen said, his voice carrying across the tense silence with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose, "you should know that I recognize you, Captain Morrison. I remember your voice from the day you murdered my son in our peaceful camp. I remember your face from the day you destroyed this horse's family in Willow Canyon. I remember your cruelty, and I remember your cowardice." Morrison's face went white, then flushed with rage as he realized that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling in front of the very people he had hoped to manipulate. "Shut your mouth, Indian, or you'll what?" Dasheen interrupted, his calm finally giving way to the righteous anger that had been building in his heart for years. "Kill me as you killed my son? Destroy me as you destroyed this horse's family? I'm not afraid of death, Captain. I have been preparing for this moment since the day I held my son's body in my arms." The Mustang's wild neighing filled the air, as if he too was voicing the pain and anger that had been trapped inside him for too long. The sound was raw, primal, carrying echoes of loss and rage that touched something deep in every person present. Sheriff Bradley found himself caught between legal obligation and moral certainty, his hand hovering over his weapon as he tried to calculate the best course of action in an impossible situation. Sarah stood frozen with fear and determination, clutching the evidence that could expose Morrison's crimes, but knowing that truth alone might not be enough to prevent tragedy. As the tension reached its breaking point, Dasheen opened his hands, and let the prayer stones fall to the dusty ground, where they landed with soft thuds that seemed to echo like thunder in the charged atmosphere. "I call upon my ancestors," he said in Apache, his voice rising in a chant that was both prayer and challenge. "I call upon the spirits of the four directions to witness what happens here today." Morrison's men moved with the coordinated precision of soldiers following well-rehearsed orders, forming a semicircle around the stockyards that effectively cut off any possibility of escape. But as they took their positions, something unexpected began to happen in Cedar Ridge. The sound of Dasheen's chanting, combined with the Mustang's wild calling, had begun to draw people from throughout the town. They came at first in small groups, children who had grown to love the morning music, women who had watched the healing work with growing wonder, men who had witnessed the impossible transformation of the untamable horse. Word spread quickly through the small community, and soon a crowd was gathering at the edges of the stockyards, drawn by curiosity and growing concern for the Apache warrior who had brought something approaching magic to their dusty frontier. Dr. Harrison arrived with his medical bag, followed closely by Martha Henderson and several other prominent citizens who had watched Dasheen's patient work with increasing respect. Even Father Miguel from the small Catholic church had come, his weathered face reflecting the confusion of a man trying to reconcile his theological training with the undeniable spiritual power he had witnessed in the Apache ceremonies. "What's the meaning of this, Morrison?" demanded Marcus Whitmore, the banker who had previously supported aggressive action against the horse. "I thought we were simply dealing with a dangerous animal, not staging some kind of military operation." Morrison's jaw tightened as he realized that his carefully planned confrontation was becoming a public spectacle. "This is official territorial business," he replied, his voice carrying forced authority. "I have legal warrants and jurisdiction in this matter." But Sheriff Bradley had been examining the document Morrison had produced, and his expression grew increasingly skeptical as he studied the official seals and signatures. "This warrant was issued awfully quickly," he observed, almost like someone knew in advance what evidence they'd need to present. As the crowd continued to grow, Dasheen stepped back from his confrontation with Morrison and approached the corral gate with movements that were deliberate and ceremonial. His weathered hands bore traces of red clay that he had applied while chanting war paint, but painted in patterns that spoke of spiritual protection rather than aggressive intent. "I will not run," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "I will not hide. If Harold Morrison wishes to complete the work he began when he murdered my son and destroyed this horse's family, let him do it openly, in front of witnesses who can judge the truth of his actions." The crowd stirred uneasily as the implications of Dasheen's words sank in. Morrison was not simply some territorial official enforcing the law. He was a participant in the very events that had shaped this confrontation. The Apache warrior's calm dignity in the face of obvious danger stood in stark contrast to Morrison's aggressive posturing, and several people began to voice questions about what was really happening. Morrison realized that the situation was slipping beyond his control. Drawing his revolver with practiced ease, he pointed it directly at Dasheen's chest. "I've had enough of your lies and accusations, Indian. You're under arrest, and that horse is going to be put down. Anyone who interferes will be charged with obstructing territorial law enforcement." But Dasheen showed no fear as he faced the weapon that could end his life. Instead, he reached for the corral gate with steady hands, his movements unhurried, despite the gun trained on him. "If you are going to shoot me," he said calmly, "you will have to do it while I stand with spirit. We have found each other in this life, and we will face whatever comes together." The gate swung open with its familiar creak, and for the first time since his capture, the Mustang had an unrestricted path to freedom. Yet instead of bolting for the open desert, the magnificent brown horse stepped forward to stand beside Dasheen, his powerful frame radiating calm strength despite The obvious tension that filled the air, the sight of man and horse standing together in perfect unity, drew gasps of amazement from the crowd. Here was the creature that had terrorized the community for months, now standing peacefully beside the Apache warrior who had somehow reached across the gulf of species and trauma to forge a bond that transcended ordinary understanding. Morrison's hand trembled slightly as he maintained his aim, clearly shaken by the transformation he was witnessing. "Get away from that animal," he ordered, his voice cracking with stress. "It's dangerous, unpredictable. You're putting everyone here at risk." "Am I?" Dasheen asked quietly, placing one weathered hand on the Mustang's neck in a gesture of mutual trust and support. "Or are you afraid that people will see the truth you've been trying to hide for years?" As if summoned by the confrontation, Sarah pushed through the crowd, carrying the wooden crate containing Morrison's military records. Her face was pale, but determined as she approached Sheriff Bradley, the documents clutched against her chest, like evidence that could change everything. "Tom," she called out, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I have papers here that prove everything Dasheen has said. Morrison's own reports, describing the raids that killed his son and destroyed this horse's family. His signature, his seal, his own words condemning him." Morrison's face went white with rage and fear as he realized that his carefully buried past was about to be exposed. "Those documents are classified military records," he snarled. "Possession of them is a federal crime. Then why were they hidden in a crate in my store's back room?" Sarah shot back, her fear giving way to righteous anger. Why has a supposedly law-abiding citizen been concealing evidence of his own war crimes? In the tense silence that followed Sarah's accusation, something extraordinary happened that would be remembered in Cedar Ridge for generations to come. A single white eagle feather, pristine and perfect, drifted down from the clear morning sky to land gently on the Mustang's dark mane, where it rested like a blessing from the spirit world. The crowd fell silent at this apparition, many recognizing it as a sign of profound spiritual significance, even if they did not understand its specific meaning. Dasheen's eyes widened with wonder as he saw the feather settle on Spirit's neck, and his voice when he spoke was filled with reverence and joy. "Running Bear," he whispered in Apache, his weathered hands reaching up to touch the sacred gift. "My son sends his blessing on this moment. He tells us that peace is stronger than violence, that understanding conquers fear, that love never truly dies." The Mustang stood perfectly still as Dasheen gently lifted the white feather from his mane, holding it up so that all could see this tangible proof that forces beyond human understanding were at work in their midst. The horse's dark eyes reflected a calm that seemed to emanate from some deep well of spiritual peace, and his breathing remained steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Morrison, however, appeared increasingly desperate as he watched his carefully constructed plans crumble before his eyes. The combination of Sarah's evidence, the crowd's growing skepticism, and the undeniable spiritual power of what was unfolding had begun to erode his authority and expose the fear that lay beneath his aggressive facade. "Enough of this superstitious nonsense," he shouted, his voice breaking with strain. "I don't care about feathers or Indian magic. I have legal authority here, and I'm going to use it." With that declaration, Morrison raised his revolver and fired a shot into the air, the sharp crack of gunpowder echoing across the stockyards like thunder. The sound should have sent the Mustang into panicked flight, triggering the wild terror that had defined his response to violence for months. Instead, Spirit remained perfectly calm beside Dasheen, the white feathers still clutched in the Apache warrior's gentle hands. The crowd watched in amazement as the horse that had been driven to madness by far lesser provocations now stood serene in the face of actual gunfire. It was as if the healing work that Dasheen had performed had not simply calmed the animal's fears, that had transformed him into something approaching the sacred, a creature that had moved beyond fear into a realm of spiritual peace. Morrison's men began to shift uncomfortably, clearly shaken by what they were witnessing. These were hard men accustomed to violence and quick solutions, but the sight of such obvious grace and dignity in the face of their threatening behavior was causing them to question their orders and their loyalties. "You see?" Dasheen said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "Violence has no power over spirits that have found peace. Fear cannot touch hearts that have learned to trust. You can shoot me, Captain Morrison, but you cannot kill what my son and I have built together in this place." Sheriff Bradley, who had been studying Sarah's documents with growing anger, finally stepped forward with his own weapon drawn. But instead of supporting Morrison's authority, he pointed his gun directly at the man who claimed to represent territorial law enforcement. "Harold Morrison," he said in his official capacity, "I'm placing you under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and suspicion of murder. These documents provide clear evidence of war crimes that were never reported to proper authorities. And your behavior here today suggests you've been using false credentials to manipulate legal proceedings." Morrison's face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized that his position was completely untenable. His own men were wavering in their support. The crowd was turning against him, and the very people he had hoped to intimidate were now standing firm in their defense of the Apache warrior and his magnificent horse. "This is mutiny," Morrison screamed, swinging his weapon wildly as he tried to find a target that would restore his authority. "I am a duly appointed territorial representative, and I order all of you to stand down immediately." But his protests fell on deaf ears as more and more of the crowd began to move forward, no longer content to stand passively while injustice was perpetrated in their community. Dr. Harrison approached with his medical bag, ready to treat any injuries that might result from the confrontation. Father Miguel began speaking prayers in both Spanish and English, calling upon divine protection for all involved. Even young children who had come to love Dasheen's music pressed forward, their innocent presence serving as a powerful reminder of what was truly at stake. In desperation, Morrison turned his weapon toward the Mustang, perhaps hoping that destroying the symbol of Dasheen's success would somehow restore his psychological advantage. "If I can't have legal authority," he snarled, "I'll settle for removing the problem permanently." But as his finger tightened on the trigger, Dasheen stepped directly between Morrison and the horse, the white eagle feather still held high in his weathered hand. "If you want to complete the work you began when you killed my son," he said with infinite dignity, "you will have to shoot me first. And then these people will know exactly what kind of man you really are." The moment stretched like a held breath, suspended between violence and redemption, between the forces of fear and the power of love. In that crystalline instant, every person present understood that they were witnessing something that would define not just their own lives, but the very soul of their community for generations to come. 3 months had passed since that transformative morning when Cedar Ridge learned the true meaning of courage and witnessed the power of healing over vengeance. The Arizona Territory autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and amber, and the small frontier town had settled into rhythms that would have been unimaginable during the dark days of fear and division that had preceded Harold Morrison's exposure and arrest. The former cavalry captain now awaited trial in Tucson, his political connections proving insufficient to protect him once the evidence of his war crimes became public knowledge. Sarah's discovery of his hidden documents had opened an investigation that reached all the way to Washington, exposing a pattern of abuse and cover-up that had affected dozens of Apache families across the Southwest. Justice, long delayed, was finally beginning to find its voice. In Cedar Ridge itself, the transformation was evident in ways both large and small. The stockyards, once a place of fear and violence, had become something approaching a pilgrimage site, drawing visitors from across the territory who came to witness the miracle of the Apache warrior and his remarkable horse. But more than curiosity brought these travelers. They came seeking the healing that Dasheen had somehow made possible in this unlikely place. Dasheen himself had found peace in ways that surprised even him. His marriage to Sarah 2 months earlier had been a quiet ceremony that blended Apache traditions with Christian rituals, creating something beautiful and new that honored both cultures without compromising either. Their union represented more than personal happiness. It symbolized the possibility of building bridges across the cultural divides that had caused so much pain in the past. The Mustang, now universally known as Spirit, roamed freely throughout the area but returned each evening to the corral that had once been his prison. The transformation in his behavior remained a source of wonder to all who witnessed it. Where there had once been rage and terror, there was now a dignity and grace that spoke of a creature who had found his place in a world that had initially offered him nothing but violence. Children from the town spent hours in Spirit's company, learning patience and gentleness from an animal who had once embodied everything wild and dangerous about the frontier. Under Dasheen's guidance, they learned not just how to approach horses safely, but how to listen with their hearts to the needs of creatures different from themselves. These lessons in empathy and understanding would shape their characters for the rest of their lives. The morning music continued as well, drawing crowds that now included Apache families who had traveled from distant reservations to hear Dasheen play his son's flute and share the wisdom of his people. These gatherings had evolved into informal schools where different cultures exchanged knowledge and traditions, creating understanding where there had once been only suspicion and fear. Sarah's general store had become an unofficial museum, displaying not only Morrison's incriminating documents, but also artifacts from Dasheen's culture that helped visitors understand the rich traditions that had shaped his approach to healing and harmony. The new leather bridle that the townspeople had crafted as a wedding gift hung in a place of honor, its intricate design incorporating both Apache symbols and Christian crosses in a pattern that spoke of unity rather than division. Dr. Harrison had documented the healing process extensively, hoping to share what he had learned with medical colleagues who might benefit from understanding the connection between emotional trauma and physical behavior. His reports to medical journals in the East described techniques that went far beyond conventional veterinary practice, opening new avenues of thought about the treatment of traumatized animals and humans alike. But perhaps the most significant change was in the community itself. The crisis had forced the people of Cedar Ridge to examine their own prejudices and assumptions, to look beyond surface differences and recognize the common humanity that connected them all. Where there had once been suspicion of outsiders, there was now curiosity about different ways of understanding the world. Where there had once been quick resort to violence, there was now an appreciation for patience and persistence. Sheriff Bradley, whose integrity had been tested and proven during those crucial moments, found himself dealing with a community that had learned to value justice over expedience. Disputes that might once have escalated to violence were now brought to him for mediation, with both parties seeking solutions that honored the dignity of all involved. The Apache approach to conflict resolution, emphasizing restoration over punishment, had begun to influence the entire community's approach to maintaining peace. On this particular autumn morning, as Dasheen prepared for his daily session with Spirit and the children who came to learn from both of them, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this place of unexpected contentment. The eagle feather that had appeared during his confrontation with Morrison now rested in a place of honor in the home he shared with Sarah, a daily reminder of his son's continuing presence in his life. The prayer stones that his grandmother had given him so many years ago sat on their kitchen table, no longer symbols of a warrior's preparation for battle, but touchstones for a man who had learned that the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into friends. Each morning, he touched each stone and spoke the prayers they represented for strength to face the day's challenges, wisdom to guide those who sought his counsel, courage to continue the work of healing, and peace to fill the hearts of all who suffered as he had once suffered. As Spirit approached the fence with his characteristic grace, Dasheen smiled at the sight of the white feather that the horse still wore woven into his mane. The Mustang had never allowed anyone to remove it, seeming to understand its significance as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of spirits where Running Bear watched over them all. "Good morning, my friend," Dasheen said in Apache, his weathered hand reaching out to stroke the horse's neck. Spirit nickered softly in response, his dark eyes reflecting a contentment that mirrored his human companion's own sense of fulfillment. In the distance, Sarah emerged from their home carrying a basket of food for the day's visitors, her smile brightening the morning more effectively than the rising sun. Children's voices could be heard approaching from the town, excited and eager for another day of learning from the man who had taught them that understanding was always possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain, and Dasheen breathed deeply of air that no longer held the bitter taste of old grief. He had not forgotten his son, would never forget, but he had learned to carry that love forward into new relationships rather than allowing it to burden him with perpetual sorrow. As he raised the wooden flute to his lips to begin the day's music, Dasheen offered a silent prayer of gratitude to the spirits who had guided him through darkness into light, and to the magnificent horse who had taught him that healing was always possible for those willing to approach each other with patience, respect, and open hearts.